This is the Something About Your podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, Esther Wojcicki. How are you doing?
I'm very happy to be here and to meet you.
I'm really excited about this. Esther is a journalist. Well, I was going to say first, but in no particular order, a journalist and educator. She founded the Palo Alto High School Media Arts Program, Palo Alto High School. She has written a book, How to Raise Successful People, Simple Lessons for Radical Results. That book has been praised by the likes of Gavin Newsom, who's now the governor of California, Arianna Huffington, Laureen Powell Jobs, and Mark Benioff. So you've been leading a busy life.
Yes, it's really fun to socialize with them.
How did you come to journalism of like all the things in the world? You came early to it, right?
I came to journalism as a high school student. Can you imagine, at age 14? And I know it sounds...
Age 14, I didn't know what movie I wanted to see or what girl I wanted to...
What I was interested in is influencing people's opinion and getting the information straight. And so I was very interested in it. It turns out that I was really bad as a salesperson because I had to earn money, and so I had tried to be a salesperson at a local clothing store, just a small store. And after a week, they told me that they didn't really need me anymore. It's because I told all the people what I really thought of what they looked like, and that didn't work.
That doesn't work. Yeah.
But
perfect for journalism.
It was perfect for journalism, and I loved being in journalism and being trained by all the people in that newspaper. That was a very small paper.
At that age, was there a hero? So Walter Cronkite, the range from Walter Cronkite to Hunter S. Thompson. Was there a hero, or was it just something that you figured on your own?
There was not really a hero for me. It was more, well, of course I saw all those people on TV, but it was really more of a situation where I wanted to have an impact of some kind, and I wanted to be able to do it in a way that people were reading it. So back in those days, people used to say, if it's in print, it must be true.
Right.
And so it was great, an exciting thing for me. Oh my God, I'm in print and my name's there. God, what I wrote must be true.
Right.
Well, I was very conscious about like making sure it was, quote, true.
Right.
And but it was an exciting experience for me.
And what was the state? Well, I'm fascinated by kind of the mechanics of, and I literally mean the mechanics of journalism in that, and this will be really old for people listening to this podcast, but there was a time when you would literally set a newspaper in metal pieces.
I was there at that time. That was what was going on in high school.
There's literally a weight to that.
That's right. It was lead, molten lead, that was then made into these things called slugs. You put the slugs together, and then you put it in a tray, and then you printed from that metal conglomeration, and it happened all the time, and it was called print shop, and a lot of the boys in the school took the print shop, and that was not allowed. Well, let's put it this way, it was highly discouraged for girls. And so I did they had a newspaper program, a very small newspaper program, which I took, which I thought was, pretty exciting. And, but the most exciting thing of all was that the local newspaper, which was a weekly called the Sunland Tahunga Record Ledger, hired me. And I was honored, thrilled, and they also taught me how to write.
And the newspaper then, still does, but it seems that there's a weight to it. Like you literally put you print it with using these heavy lead things. People gather around it in a way that you wouldn't today because there's so many choices. Like the paper would be the thing that the community
it was the thing
for and discussed.
It was a big event. It came out once a week, and everybody waited for it, and it told you what was happening in your community. There was no other way to get it. It was, we didn't have our own private radio station or television station. And this is a little town in the northern part of the San Fernando Valley. And so the newspaper was kind of it.
Right.
That was, it was an event.
And how did you come to, this is everything, I guess, we're in the tech industry, but pretty male-dominated business, I would think, even among male-dominated businesses.
Was 100% male-dominated. The reason they hired me, I was kind of like the Girl Friday. And they were overworked, like a lot of journalists. And so they thought, we'll train her and we'll see whether she can't help us do our job. And it turned out that I loved doing it and I trained pretty well. And so they kept me for 3 years.
Right.
It's like, thank you.
It's incredible. It seems for me, I don't know what you think, but one of the sadder losses from technology, newspapers for sure, but the New York Times and LA Times seem fine. It's those local newspapers, both in those communities that seem to be disappearing, but also in government. Like, as I understand it, maybe this is a movie version of journalism, but there used to be people who would work for, say, the Sacramento Bee, who would spend weeks sort of studying something like City Hall, and they'd realize that that guy was paying money to that guy, and after 3 months, they'd uncover some scandal in Sacramento. And it seems like those types of papers, that type of journalism has been diminished.
It has been diminished a lot. And I mean, journalism was kind of one of the exciting highlights of the community. And I used to go to the city council member meetings, and they were also kind of a highlight of what people were thinking about and doing. And it was kind of a big deal. We didn't have there was no social media. Some of us had TVs, but the TVs were very small, black and white usually, and so you listened to the radio, and but primarily the newspaper was a big deal, and the city council meetings were where it happened.
Right. And then did you think about going on to whatever the big show was from there? Would that be Sacramento or San Francisco or Chicago?
This was in the Los Angeles area, so I considered going on to a bigger paper. And in the summer, I've forgotten what year that might have been, but it was in the 50s, late 50s. I was hired by a newspaper called the Los Angeles Mercury News. Los Angeles Mirror. Yeah. It was Mirror, something like that. And I got to write a column once a week on what teenagers were thinking.
That's fabulous.
Oh, that was amazing.
And what were teenagers thinking at the time?
Well, they were not thinking anything like they're thinking things today. They were thinking about, like, what was good to wear, and they were talking a lot about music, so that's common. And there was a lot of information about dances and, parties, places that you could go, but they're nothing like it was around here today. And, it was a different world.
A quieter time, I guess.
It was much quieter.
I don't know, do kids have dances anymore? I don't even know if that's a thing.
They do have dances, but they don't have the same draw that they had back then. The dances at the school were a big deal. I mean, they were the place where you went. Right. And you wanted to, it was kind of hard if you didn't have anybody to dance with. That's where the word wallflower came from.
Right.
And so
dance card, I guess that was earlier. I guess the dance card would have been a little.
It was a little earlier, but it was kind of exciting. So I would write about that. I did write about some student opinion at the time. Most of the people that lived in this little town, Sunland, Tujunga, they didn't go to college. They went to, at the most, a local community college. Right. It was the pressures were very different.
Right. And so you're writing a newspaper column. That's kind of seems like pinnacle journalism. I mean, that's the thing that you want to do. You want to be Herb Caen or the New York Times columnist. What was the step after that?
I mean, that was, this was the Mirror News, as I recall.
Sure.
Though after that was the Los Angeles Times.
Yeah.
And they hired me because, they don't like the competition, right?
Yeah.
To write a column, too.
Wow.
And so, I wrote a column for the Los Angeles Times, and then they also let me write for what was called the women's section.
Oh, boy, yeah.
You remember? I don't know if you are old enough.
That.
Okay, well, this was the 50s and the 60s. They had a section of the paper. It was the news section, the sports section, the opinion section and the women's section.
Wow.
And the women's section was full of recipes and how to take care of your baby and how to clean the house properly and
Wow.
Advice columns like Dear Abby. They were in the women's section.
Right.
And so I was allowed to write for the women's section, and it was usually things about food. I was allowed to write about food, but I always had to be really careful. Sounds crazy. Not to say something about a product that the newspaper was advertising that could be seen in any way as negative.
Oh, right.
Because they don't want the advertiser to be upset.
Right. I think I remember home economics in like the tail end of high school. They had kind of the home economics concept where you learn cooking and budgeting for the household. But I think by that point they'd sort of opened it up to boys, and then I think it disappeared shortly thereafter.
Well, in my era, in the 50s, 60s, was home economics was for the girls. So all the girls took home ec and sewing.
Yeah.
And the boys never took home ec, but they took like carpentry
Yeah.
and machine shop.
Right.
And sometimes they would take print shop where they would print the paper.
Yeah.
And they did take auto shop.
Yeah, we had auto shop, I think, at my high school.
Yeah.
Before California had a proposition called Prop 13 that sort of got rid of a lot of the funding for things in schools like auto shops.
Right. Yeah, that was kind of sad because auto shop was fun.
Yeah.
A lot of guys they would drive their cars, kind of usually old, somewhat beat up cars to school and then demonstrate to everybody, girls included,
Of course.
like all the great things they had done to fix up their car.
Yeah. I miss that. So nostalgic. So how do you why somehow you end up not being in the newspaper side of journalism? You're not at the LA Times anymore. You move on to education at some point. What animated that or motivated that?
So I went to school at Berkeley, and I majored in political science and English. And while I was there, I worked for a newspaper called the Berkeley Daily Gazette.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just, again, a small local newspaper. I just did a few things, and I always needed to earn money, so I had to actually really work.
Right.
And then after that, when I graduated, I moved to France with my husband. I got married very early.
Yeah.
At 20. It was interesting. When I got married, I thought I was old.
Right.
Because everybody got married like at 18. And I was like, oh my God, 20? Wow.
Isn't that a crazy transition? Like now you meet people in their 30s who are like still thinking about getting to it in their 40s, like years, decades beyond what you were thinking.
Well, I just think about it decades because, today you see people, young women or women having babies in their 40s, 41, 42, 43. My first child went to college when I was 44.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was just a very different world. But getting back to your original question, what I did after we came back from France is I wanted to work for a local newspaper, like the San Francisco Chronicle or something like that. It was the Examiner. San Francisco Examiner was also a big paper back then. And there was a lot of discrimination against women. I couldn't even get into the San Francisco Press Club because it was a men-only club. And the only section of the paper I was allowed to write for was the women's section. I couldn't write news or opinion. They let me write obituaries. Well, I did not want to do that all the time. And so I thought to myself, well, I don't want to drive. I don't want to just be stuck in the women's section. So maybe I should just teach journalism instead of just be a journalist.
Right.
And so that's how I ended up becoming a journalism teacher.
That's fantastic. And how did you find this place of all places in the world in Palo Alto, California?
My husband had gotten his doctorate at Berkeley in physics. He's a high-energy particle physicist.
Mm-hmm.
And then he got an offer for a position at Stanford, a non-tenure track assistant professor. And so we moved here, and then I thought that, gee, maybe I could do something, or, maybe we would move because, tenure at Stanford's kind of iffy.
Sure.
And some miracle happened, and he was offered a tenure track position.
Wow.
And so I was like, oh, I have to rethink what I'm doing. Here I am at Stanford. And, there's like no newspaper here. Oh, there was the Palo Alto Times-Tribune, but it was a smaller paper. I was thinking about a bigger paper.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to travel, because at that point I already had one child, and I thought, well, maybe I should do something local.
Yeah.
And that's how I made that decision.
So what was the sojourn, the trip off to France? What was that part of your journey?
Well, my husband had gotten a National Science Foundation postdoctoral award, and so we moved to Geneva, Switzerland, to start, where he was at something called CERN,
Sure.
Center for European Nuclear Research. And I was just like 21 or 22. I was just out of school, and I was like, oh, what am I going to do now? And of course, I didn't have a permit to work. So I was like, oh my God, there's the University of Geneva. Why don't I just go to school there? Oh, right. So I just appeared at the doorstep there with my little transcript in hand, and they took me. It's amazing. So I became a student at the University of Geneva in international relations. Turns out they forgot to ask me if I could speak French. And I couldn't. Yes. So they put me into an intensive French program for about 5 months, during which time I managed to get up to speed in 5 months, and then I became matriculated.
Do you still speak French?
Yes. Je parle français.
I know. La Jolla High School is part of the San Diego School District. I studied French, which, if you know San Diego, is ridiculous. You should probably take Spanish if
yes,
you're living in San Diego. You're on the Mexican border.
Right.
I don't even know why they offered it to a... But, as a 15-year-old, there's some cute girl in the French class, and that's
the draw.
So goes your education. So back in Palo Alto, you're raising kids, which it becomes relevant because you later write a book about how to raise successful people. And you have 3 daughters, Susan, Janet, and Anne, who have all become, I think this is pretty well known, wildly successful. One is a famous epidemiologist. One runs Google. Runs YouTube. And one founded and runs 23andMe, the famous genetic testing and genealogy company.
Right.
And at some point you decide, I should explain to people how this kind of extraordinarily unusual thing happened. As you were raising kids early, did you have a philosophy about what you were doing, or was there something you'd seen in your parents that you thought, I want to copy that or not copy that, as the case may be?
So what I wanted to do is I wanted to not copy what my parents had done. They were immigrants, Russian immigrants, and we were really poor. My father was an artist, and he had a really hard time making a living. He ended up being a gravestone carver, so he made thousands of gravestones that are in Los Angeles. Wow. He was very talented in terms of art.
What type of art was he? Was a painter? Or
he was a painter, and then he became a sculptor also because, he worked on granite, on stone,
Sure.
and he actually did a beautiful job, and it was kind of sad because he never really appreciated himself to that degree, because he was always, people measure themselves by the amount of money they make.
Right.
And, he was doing a great service for people because he produced those beautiful stones.
Right.
But anyway, so I grew up with very little, and with my father had the philosophy coming from Russia of spare the rod, spoil the child. Mm-hmm. And so they didn't want to spoil the child. So there was a lot of rod situations, and I didn't ever want to repeat that. And I wanted my children to be as independent as possible, as early as possible, just to be able to know that they could do whatever it is they wanted to do. And I might have been a little bit extreme because, I taught them a lot of things early, like they couldn't read, and we would drive down the street, and I was like, oh, here's Raymundo Street, and here is Page Mill Road. And I made, I was like, in case you happen to walk here, I want you to know the name of the street. And then I taught them how to ride bikes early, and it was like how to get from point A to point B. And there was a little dime store in Palo Alto called Patterson's Dime Store, which was their favorite hangout. And I taught them how to get from the house to Patterson's Dime Store. I basically wanted them to feel good about themselves and to feel like they could control their environment. And I think that really is what made the big difference. The fact that they trusted themselves and believed in themselves as very early. Right. They would come home and they would say things like, that I didn't really have a good time at those people's house, so I'm not sure I want to go another time. They didn't have a temper tantrum or anything. They would verbalize it. Right. And that's just the way I wanted them to be able to express the way they felt. And they did.
Was the philosophy, it's funny, I don't have kids, so of course, the most useless thing is like what I think about raising kids. But that's a specialty of my podcast. So my parents had a bit of a tone, and maybe a lot of parents in the 70s and 80s, of it was like, we're not going to be around forever, was their idea. So like, you need to learn this, you need to learn that, because we're not going to be there for you. Whether they meant they weren't going to be literally around, or you're going to be going to school in Chicago and we're not there. You need to figure it out for yourself.
So that was also a lot of the philosophy, that we are not going to always be there. And then I had a friend on the Stanford campus who was about the same age as I was, and she had multiple sclerosis. Mm. And she was a pretty advanced case of multiple sclerosis. And I used to take care of her kids. We would trade. And her philosophy was, I am not going to be here, and so I want to make sure my boys can take care of themselves. So that somehow reinforced my idea of being independent. And I remember her boys were always way ahead. I was really impressed with what they could do. I mean, I was babysitting for them, but they would walk over from their house to my house for me to babysit for them. And they were like 4 and 5.
Right.
And then I would call and say, oh, yeah, they're here. And, she did pass away when they were about 8 or 9. And I always remember that was really important, the things she taught them.
Yeah. I'm struck by my friends who are quite successful, that you listen to some of their stories, and I contrast it to what you hear about how kids are being raised today. And at young ages, like 10, or I don't know if this would be okay anymore, but at young ages, they were going from New Jersey into downtown New York on their own, on the train, for example. And, if you said that to somebody today, they'd be mortified. But they were doing that.
But that's what I was. So we live on the Stanford campus, and my kids belong to SCRA, Stanford Campus Recreation Association. And we lived about a mile from SCRA. And they were 6 and 7 years old, and they rode their bikes by themselves there.
Right.
And then I also remember that my younger daughter, Janet, she used to ride her bike by herself from our house to San Antonio Shopping Center. I don't know if you know how far that is. It's from Page Mill Road to San Antonio. And, she was about 8 years old, 7 years old, and she never thought twice about it. And I didn't either, right. Because I had taught her how to ride the bike. It's interesting also, we didn't have helmets back then.
We never had helmets either, and I don't remember any kid ever hurting his head. I don't remember, I just remember the time that I tried to save her from sliding down a very tall slide, and I broke my toe, and she was just fine. Right.
Yeah. So, she was always fine, and all those bike rides that they did, they were all fine.
Yeah, there wasn't a helmet around growing up when I was a kid, and I don't also remember anybody having, you'd fall off once, and you'd kind of go, okay, I better not do that again, and you'd kind of...
Well, they were when you learn to ride a bike when you're really small, they really were adept. They could ride those bikes without holding on the handles, And, my husband, being born in Poland during the war, he didn't learn to ride a bike till he was about 25.
Oh.
And it turns out you can't learn to ride a bike well when you're an adult.
Yeah, I believe that.
He had a really hard time.
Yeah. It's just it's fascinating how different it's become. I remember growing up, and the ethos for, I don't know, maybe we were 8 or 9, was like, go out and play. Now maybe something's changed. Go out and play, be back by dark.
That's right.
And panic didn't really set in for your parents if you were home like even an hour after dark. They were still like, damn it, let's go find the kid and bring him back. Now, one difference is there were kind of packs of kids.
Right.
Like there were bunches of kids. So your parents were like, well, he's probably with the other kids. We weren't just alone.
Right.
But they were just kind of like, get the heck out of here and come back by, sunset if you want to eat.
That's exactly right. And that's what they would always go to this Stanford,
Right.
And they would go, and I would say, you have to be back by 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock because that's when we're having dinner.
Right.
And so just come back then. There were no cell phones. There was
Right.
no way for me to ever know if they got there.
That's the other part. There was no communication of like,
No.
call me when you get there. It
Right.
was like, just be back in 6 hours.
Don't forget to take your tennis racket, the balls, here's your swimsuit, and then see you.
Right.
And that was it.
And everyone seems to have survived.
Yeah, and then they became members of the SCRA swim team, and that was a big deal. We used to go on the weekends, and it was exciting.
Yeah.
But they did it themselves. They rode their bikes down to swim practice themselves. No one drove them.
Right.
So
as you years later write a book about how to raise successful people, what do you make of the world we live in now that seems quite the opposite of this? It seems parents doing things for their kids that in different time you wouldn't have done for your 8-year-old. You're now doing for your 22-year-old, taking care of their laundry or whatever it is.
I think it's a mistake. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal that came out last Saturday, I believe it was, and it was talking about, are your kids ready emotionally for college? It's a great article. I recommend it. Because the answer is most kids are not. And why the answer in the article, and I agree with it, is that what has happened is we have pampered them to such a degree and done so many things for them that by the time they get to college, they don't feel ready to do things on their own because they've been so cared for. And it's a sense of, it's over safetyism. It's too careful. And a lot of teenagers try to break out of that, and that's where the conflict comes between the parents and the teens. It's like, oh, I can do this on my own. But today we have apps and all kinds of electronic devices to control our teens. I mean, it's not just, an app to find my phone. It's an app to find my kid.
Right.
And so there's zero privacy.
I hear stories now of, like, I can't imagine, of parents almost moving to college with their kid or moving to the surrounding area to be around their kid. It sounds terrible to me as a college kid.
Well, so Julie Litcott-Haynes, the former dean of admissions at Stanford, wrote a very good book I recommend, How to Raise an Adult. And that's exactly what she talked about. All these parents moving to Palo Alto to be next to their Stanford student. But it's not just Stanford, it's other schools too. So at what point does your child become an adult? Yeah. And that's like how to raise an adult.
Yeah. Well, and your kid got into Stanford too, not you. So
that's right. Your kid got into Stanford. And so, so Julie and I, our books complement each other. Yeah. And we've been thinking about, we're probably going to do a book talk together.
Well, that would be fabulous. So you come, in your book, you boil it down or express it as an acronym called TRIC, which is trust, respect, independence, collaboration, and kindness. Is that the pieces that people should start thinking about for their...
Well, I was trying to make it into something that people could remember all the time. And this is really an acronym that's easy to remember. And so before you do something, to or with your child or in school, you should ask yourself, is this giving my child a sense that I trust him and respect him? And you just have to ask how you would feel in that situation. And especially in classrooms, as a teacher, what am I doing to make my students feel trusted? And why do I want them to feel trusted? Because when you feel trusted by someone you respect, you trust yourself.
Right.
And that's the key to grit. You want to pursue what you think is important in life. Never going to pursue it if you're doubting yourself.
Right. And so educators can be part of this as well, as it's not just the parents who need to.
It's educators. The book is targeting parents, educators, and actually managers, the corporate world. Because in business, people that are trusted and respected in their job don't want to dash out the door at 5 o'clock.
That's right.
And we all want to have a sense of we're doing something that matters.
Is there any place for, going back to the kids and the teenagers, for rebellion in this? I recall some of my very successful friends had brushes with the law, ended up in situations, that maybe you wouldn't want your kid to be in. I don't know. What's your sense of that, where they have a couple things that happen, but they're fine, and they end up being very successful? And
well, that's why we have juvenile law court, and that's why we, after, before 18 and above is a different law, way of dealing with people. Below 18, a lot of kids make mistakes.
right.
And so what we want to do is we don't want to penalize them for a lifetime for mistakes they made when they were teenagers or young kids. And so you do want to teach them. You, the parents, want to teach them. But if somehow you missed out, the law will teach them. But it can't be punitive to such a degree that it destroys their life.
Right.
And so that's really important. It's actually restorative justice. It's a whole new way of treating kids who are doing things that are outside the law. Can we explain to them what they did that was problematic? Of course, if you shoplifting, you know what you did.
Right.
But still, that shouldn't color your whole life if you do that at the age of 16.
Right.
So, yes, I think it's important, restorative justice.
Is there as I listen to this, I'm wondering if there's I think of some of the behaviors, moving to Palo Alto to go, helicopter around your kids, and lower income families. Some of the things that lower income families are doing may, out of necessity, be more similar to what you're talking about. That is, maybe one parent's not around, the other's working, so the kid is taking the bus by themselves to school, for example. In fact, I know this happens. My girlfriend was a teacher in a tough part of San Francisco, and she said she had some kids, 8, 9, 10, who would take buses from points of the compass to get there, that a wealthier parent would have been mortified, but the kid just had to do it, and they did it.
A lot of the poorer kids, in lower income areas, are actually doing exactly that. And they seem to be okay doing it. If anything, they're actually stronger, more self-confident, more independent. As long as they don't go back to a family where there's a lot of dysfunction,
Right.
they actually are ahead. And if you read Michelle Obama's book about what Michelle Obama had to do to go to school, you will relate. It's amazing.
Yeah.
She had to take buses and all kinds of transportation to get from her house to school.
Yeah, no getting dropped off at the
No
SUV
getting
for her.
Her mom was a great mom.
Yeah.
Supported her and everything, but encouraged this independence early on, and it matters. You want your child to be independent and feel good about themselves.
So as the book comes out, what is the reaction been? Have parents and educators said, "Oh, I need to make some adjustments here," or are they pushing back and saying, "Oh, understand, I need to be with my kid in Palo Alto"?
Number one response to my book has been, "I'm sorry you didn't write it before, so I could read it earlier."
Yep.
And then the number two response has been from teenagers It's like, can you please have my parents read the book?
Yeah.
So my biggest advocates are the people who have read the book. I think I'm very honored by this.
That's fantastic. It's a fantastic book. I'll ask you, before we go, I want to ask you about the state of journalism over the arc that you've watched it. Sort of the demise. What impact do you think the demise of the physical newspaper? Because I think back to, beyond the type setting we were talking about, there was a time when you'd kind of X-Acto knife a paper together. You'd very meticulously put it together. It seems that concept is gone. Like you don't have the ritual of getting the paper and then the serendipity of reading an article you never intended to read, but it's just in the column next to you. What is your sense of what's happened?
So if you still subscribe to a newspaper, you will realize there's a big difference between reading a newspaper and reading the news online. Because in the newspaper, you open up the pages and you see articles that you were never going to even be interested in when you read it online, because your reading online is targeted just to your interests.
Right.
And I get 3 newspapers per day. My husband, he loves newspapers. And that's the main difference that we have basically between reading it online and reading it in hard copy. And I think we're becoming very narrow in our reading habits by just reading it online. And I don't know, there's something exciting about getting the newspaper every morning. And maybe it's because I've been doing it for a while. But it is exciting, and then opening it up and then sitting there. We have breakfast and coffee and your croissant and having the paper.
I just find I still, while we have it, I get the New York Times on Sunday. I go buy it and get a cup of coffee. And it is, there are a bunch of things that there's no way I would have ever read on the internet. One more story about why this guy's bad or that guy's bad. But you're just like, some story either international that you never thought about going on in Israel, or some Broadway show that you never would have read about in a million years.
Right.
But there it is, because you're flipping through one page after another, and one thing's next to another thing.
For sure. So that's why we still subscribe to all these papers. I mean, just last week, I read this article, again in the Wall Street Journal Sun weekend edition, about what is it that your dog really thinks? What does it feel like to be a dog?
Yeah.
I never would have read that if I were just like getting my all the online things that seem to be targeted to my interests.
And so how are you feeling now at this point about the sort of future of the news business as you teach kids in it to use it as YouTube, for example, and Facebook, and these things rise in prominence? And
well, the main thing I think is that all students should have a course in media literacy to teach them the subtle impact of all this media on their attitudes and their brains. And they don't know that it's having this impact, and sometimes they get depressed because of it. And if they knew more about what's happening to them, it might be better able to deal with it. I don't think that we're ever going to get rid of paper. And the reason I don't think that is because my students still want to have things in hard copy.
Really?
Yeah. They don't just want to have it online, they want to have it in their hand and feel it. And they also, my students, be happy to have you visit, by the way, and talk to them. They also say that they learn better from a textbook where they can mark up the pages than from anything online, no matter how many videos it has and no matter what features it has. They want it on hard copy.
That's pretty optimistic, actually.
Yeah. Well, if you just think about it, if you are getting a long contract from somebody and you have to make sure that every word is, the way it should be for you, honestly, you will print it out and read it.
That's right.
You will not just do it online. And so they're trying to learn. And they say the way to learn is with a hard copy book.
That's funny. It makes me more optimistic, I guess. I was interviewing on this podcast, I had a millennial, a Gen Z, I guess they call it, guy who went to school at Georgetown. And I was trying to get at, like, how do you guys interact? Are you all in your dorm rooms texting each other? And he said, no, on Friday we all get together and we grill and we hang out and drink beer. I was like, well,
that's good.
that's perfect.
Yeah.
Like, that's what we did. It works.
Yeah.
That's fabulous.
Well, education, all education, there's 3 things important in education, just like the 3 things in real estate.
Yeah.
In education, it's relationships, relationships, and relationships. So it's not a relationship with your iPad or
Right.
with your phone. It's with a human being.
That's fabulous. All right. Well, on that note, I really appreciate you doing this. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm just thrilled to get the chance to talk to you.
Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it, and I love this conversation too.
Well, thank you.
Great questions.
And how do people follow, other than buying the book or getting the book? Is there a way people follow you? Do they follow you on Twitter, or what's the?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter, and I have a website called raisesuccessfulpeople.com.
Yeah.
But I'm actually getting ready to set up a whole series of blogs.
Okay.
And I will be happy to send you the link when that's set up. And it'll be weekly responses to questions that people have in their minds.
All right. We'll stay tuned. All right. My guest has been Esther Wojcicki. This has been the Something Venture podcast. I will talk to you next time.
Thank you.